The Benjamin Dixon Show is only possible with listener support. Go to www.thebenjamindixonshow.com to register for our blog and join the Progressive Army.
But it really doesn't matter with me now, because I've been to the mountaintop. I don't mind. Like anybody, I would like to live a long life. Longevity has its place. But I'm not concerned about that now. I just want to do God's will. And He's allowed me to go up to the mountain. And I've looked over and I've seen the promised land. I may not get there with you, but I want you to know tonight that we as a people will get to the promised land.
Every year around this time, we commemorate Dr. Martin Luther King. I sometimes don't discuss him, and sometimes I discuss him in great detail. But this year marks the 50th anniversary of his assassination. He was shot just outside of the Lorraine Motel in Memphis, Tennessee, shot at 6:01 p.m. by an assassin's rifle, and he later died that evening at about 7:05 p.m. The reason I often don't talk about Dr. King is because of how much his legacy has been co-opted by everyone. I was reading a piece by Professor Eddie Glaude of Princeton University. He's been on the show several times, and one quote that stood out the most in his time piece, I'll put a link in the description, was that he identified how everyone co-opts Dr. King. Conservatives co-opt Dr. King for their vision. Liberals co-opt Dr. King for their vision. And even black politicians co-opt Dr. King for their own individual ambitions. And every year around this time, either April 4th or the Dr. King Day, the third Monday of January here in the United States, or his actual birthday, January 15th, every year someone actively co-opts the legacy, the language, and the vision of Dr. King. And he's become so watered down that every year this time we have to discuss how watered down he has become. Not because of who he was, but because of how palatable the powers that be have to make him. And not even just the powers that be, the people who consider themselves to be subversive, those people who consider themselves to be revolutionary. They too co-opt his language to make it work for their end. And I actually have no desire whatsoever to mobilize Dr. King for my own agenda. I simply, when I see him, I see a father whose children didn't get to grow up with him. I see a husband whose wife had to live raising their children alone. I see a man who wasn't a perfect man. I see a man who had all types of baggage. I see a man who had to go lean towards alcoholism, had to drink his way out of his depression, the depression of the burden of all of Black America on his shoulders, not because anyone elected him to be that role, but because he was uniquely equipped for that role. I see a man who had shortcomings with his wife and his being faithful in his marriage. But I see a man who reminds me of anyone and every single one of us who throws all of our life into accomplishing something good on behalf of other people, who oftentimes push back, who oftentimes will spit in your face, who oftentimes won't even want what you're trying to do for them, but you have a vision for something better. And sometimes those people put themselves in such harm's way, not necessarily the threat of an assassin's bullet, but we put ourselves in harm's way in terms of the things that they sacrifice. I think of Erica Gardner. I could just cut to the chase. I think of Erica, whose life was cut short, not by an assassin's bullet, but by sickness, a heart attack. She threw her entire life into her work for justice, for people, for not for herself. She wasn't going to get the justice that she wanted for her father, because justice would bring him back. But she was fighting so that no one else had to go through that. And oftentimes people attacked her and spat in her face. And I think of other people who have sacrificed their lives, not just physically actual death, but they sacrifice their lives professionally. And they give up on things that they could be doing and places they could go, all for the hope of making something better for other people. So I don't dare want to mobilize Dr. King's memory in terms of furthering my own ambitions, which I do have, or my ideology, which I most certainly have. I just look at him as a human being, a broken man who had to stand in front of millions of people and display strength, when in actuality he was deeply depressed. He had to display integrity, when in actuality he was challenged. He had to display all of these things because he had something to offer all of humanity. He had to put on a front, when in actuality he was so broken on the inside that he had to turn to his vices in order to sustain him. I see a man who talks about God being God, and yet he was broken on the inside, and his faith in God was enough to carry him through, but not necessarily enough to keep him from being broken and depressed. And I don't see a man whose head is bowed, or who was destroyed by his shortcomings, or a man who was destroyed by his depression. I don't see a tragedy. I honestly see the price of greatness. I see a person who paid the price that he had to pay in order to do what he had to do. And when I hear him speak, and when I see people commemorate him, when I see people co-opt him, I go through a myriad of emotions, from seeing this prolific preacher who was speaking power, truth to power, who was not afraid of addressing the political, economic elite of the day, who saw no third rail, who saw no sacred cow, who saw nothing that he would not challenge if he knew that challenging it would benefit not only his people, but all people. I see a man who was rather victorious. And it might contradict everything that I started off and prefaced this with, but I see a man in the midst of his brokenness, in the midst of his depression, in the midst of his personal struggles, in the midst of everything that he was going through. I see a man who was victorious, even in spite of the assassin's bullet. I see a human being. And I think one of the reasons I don't talk about him often is because I see him as a human being, and I don't see him as someone that we should just talk about 3 days out of the year: his birthday, Martin Luther King Day, and the day he was assassinated. And then we only talk about him in terms of how we can mobilize him to accomplish our agenda. I see a human. I see a father who didn't get to raise his children. I see a father who I see children who did not get to be around their father. I see a wife. I see the brokenness. I see the depression. I see the pain. I see the anguish in his eyes as he speaks. And I think of the price that each and every one of us has to pay in order to do the thing that we believe we were put here to do.
All we say to America is be true to what you said on paper. If I lived in China or even Russia or any totalitarian country, maybe I could understand some of these illegal injunctions. Maybe I could understand the denial of certain basic First Amendment privileges because they haven't committed themselves to that over that. But somewhere I read of the freedom of assembly. Somewhere I read of the freedom of speech. Somewhere I read of the freedom of press. Somewhere I read that the greatness of America is the right to protest far right.
You know, there's a group in the black community, and there's always been this group throughout the generations of people who don't believe in the hope of America. I'm going to start there. Dr. King, in this clip that you just heard, and all of these clips are from his speech, his last speech, the mountaintop speech that he gave the night before he was assassinated. You know, Dr. King believed in the promises of America, not in any type of patriotic, nationalistic way. But as he said in this clip, America made a set of promises. The founding fathers, so-called founding fathers, made a set of promises that we can all look at and say, you know what? We agree. And you know what? Not only do we agree with this, but we agree that it has to apply to even more people than you may have originally wanted it to apply to. Right? Had our founding fathers known that these promises in the Constitution, enshrined in the Constitution, would be extended to every single person that crosses the border and becomes a citizen, and every person that's born into this country, maybe they would have written something different, but they didn't. And that's too bad, because you know what? All we expect of this country is what they promised on paper. I love the context that he put this in, saying that, you know, we would not expect these things if we were in an authoritarian state, but we're not. We're in a democracy, a so-called democracy where promises were made that all men are created equal. And then we extended that to all men and women being created equal. And all of us, whether we are black and white, you know, Hispanic, Latino, wherever we come from, whatever our ethnicity, whatever our background, whatever our religion, whatever our orientation, we are to extended these rights. And this is what Dr. King advocated for. And there has always been a group in the black community who don't believe in America in that way. They don't believe in the promises of America. And this is not just something that's unique to the black community. There's every community, but I'm speaking from the perspective of being a black man, and Dr. King being a black man. There are people who look at America and think that America is only as good as what you can get from it. America is not worth the paper that's written, the Constitution is written on. You know, there are people who put no stock in the promises of the Constitution. And I think, despite the places where I may differ from Dr. King in terms of ideologies and the way I might depart from his nonviolence advocacy, almost to the point of pacifism, I might differ from him in that regard. But I think ultimately the reason I still identify the most, I don't know, it's a toss up between X and King. It's always been a toss up in the black community between X and King, but I don't think that they were mutually exclusive by any means. X being Malcolm X. They're not mutually exclusive. And I think they both needed each other. And I think each of us need a little bit of both of them inside of us. The radicalism of Malcolm X, who's willing to use the language of aggression, use the language of reciprocity, use the language of by any means necessary to get done what we need to get done, because sometimes that's all people will ever understand. Not only that, but sometimes the moment calls for action. You can't sit by in the face of violence and always be nonviolent. But then likewise, Dr. King said, America has made a set of promises. And within those set of promises, there's everything that we need for every human being to be treated with dignity and respect, and to be able to live in the society without having to receive starvation wages, and to live in a depressed, economically depressed and distraught existence. And it's all within the framework of the Constitution. So I think it's fascinating that I think it's fascinating that even in spite of the war that was going on around him, the war for civil rights, because it was a war, just a different type of war. Despite everything that he saw around him growing up, despite Jim Crow, despite the lynchings, despite of everything, the water hoses, the dogs, he was able to look at the Constitution and say, if America is just what it promised it would be, then America would be enough for everyone to be treated like a human and to be treated with dignity and respect, and to be able to live a life of dignity and respect without having to suffer the embarrassment of abject poverty. He saw the potential of what America could actually be. And this is the problem. This is what we fight for. We fight for America to become what it promised on paper. That's what we're fighting for. And the irony of it is that we're fighting against people who swear that they are standing for the Constitution, but they're attempting to conserve the promises of the Constitution for themselves and not extend those liberties and those rights and those freedoms to people with whom they disagree, whether they disagree with them religiously or they disagree with them socially, culturally. People who swear they love America, they love what America can be for them, while the rest of us are fighting for America to be, for all of us, what it promised in the Constitution.
We must also realize that the problems of racial injustice and economic injustice cannot be solved without a radical redistribution of political and economic power. And it didn't cost the nation 1 penny to integrate lunch counters. It didn't cost the nation 1 penny to guarantee the right to vote. But now we are dealing with issues that cannot be solved without the nation spending billions of dollars and undergoing a radical redistribution of economic power. Yeah.
Every year this time, either on his birthday or Dr. King Day, on the day of his assassination, people ask questions about Dr. King's economic philosophy, whether or not he was a conservative or a progressive. Was he a socialist? Well, he was a socialist. And the question really gets down to the argument that's ongoing in our country about class and race. Is it about class? Is it about economics? Or is it about race? And everyone rolls out these clips. I've even rolled out these clips to show that it's really a false dichotomy. With Dr. King, it was about both class and race. But I'm so tired of that argument. I'm so tired of that entire conversation because people don't want to concede that it can be both. People want it to be either or. And once you realize people have a vested interest in maintaining their own perspective, despite all the evidence to the contrary, what's the point of us having this argument? You know, you have people who would just as soon ignore the race component of our struggle as you have on the other side who would ignore the class side of our struggle. And I most certainly am tired of people who roll out black heroes and black figures and even some of their black friends to serve their political agenda. You know, I don't even want this. This is why I don't use Dr. King in that way. If I ever have, I certainly won't do it ever again. Use him in a way where we just roll him out. You know, we just throw him out there to answer a question. We throw him out there to push back against someone else's narrative. And it just becomes another form of using black people to accomplish someone else's political ends. Because just as soon as we say that Dr. King was talking about class, you know, there's clips of him saying things like this.
Tonight, we don't have anything to be ashamed of. Somebody told a lie one day. They couched it in language. They made everything black, ugly, and evil. Look in your dictionary and see the synonyms of the word black. There's always something degrading and low and sinister. Look at the word white. It's always something pure, high, and clean. But I want to get the language right tonight. I want to get the language so right that everybody here will cry out, yes, I'm black, I'm proud of it, I'm black and beautiful.
And I find it amazing that 50 years later, we still haven't answered this question. We haven't put this to bed. The fact that it's very simple. In this system that was built on white supremacy, that used racism as a means of instituting and perpetuating its economic grip for the economic elite, exploiting the working class of all races, it's still built on white supremacy. And until we address both of those things simultaneously in a sufficient fashion, our work is not done. But 50 years later, I receive a message from a supporter, an actual supporter of the show, who lamented over the fact that I talk about race. And that's putting it mildly. You can look at my Twitter timeline or my Facebook timeline and you can see the actual words. But they appreciated my analysis of international politics. But when it came to race, they felt as though I was race baiting. 50 years later, after everything that we've been through, after all the assassinations of the 60s, after all of the ravages of Jim Crow, the lingering vestiges of Jim Crow, after the 1980s war, or actually the war on drugs that started in the 70s, but that targeted and devastated the black community in the 80s, after the welfare queen and the young bucks of the Ronald Reagans, and after everything that transpired, and all the many ways that we've seen, even after the election of the first black president, we've seen the white lash, we've seen the resurgence of neo-Nazi groups and the KKK. After all of that, we still have people who don't understand why it's necessary, people who would call themselves progressives even, who would understand why it's necessary for us to address race. Well, it is. I don't have any fancy words right here to explain to you why it is. Because if you don't see it, I don't know that I don't know that there's any language to help you see it.
So I'm happy tonight. I'm not worried about anything. I'm not fearing any man. Mine eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord.
The Benjamin Dixon Show is only possible with listener support. Go to www.thebenjamindixonshow.com to register for our blog and join the Progressive Army.